Hi, so in part one of the tutorial I showed you how to attach the two front sides, left and right, to the back with the yoke. We're now moving on to doing the buttonhole band and the right front facing. So these will be steps 5 to 8 on the pattern that I'm using. So if you're following along in the book, that's page 32. So we're going to start by doing the buttonhole band, which is on, for a man's shirt, on the left front. So the first step is to cut away 2.5 centimetres from the left front piece and then turn over the seam allowance before adding on the band. So I'm going to do that first and then I'll show you the steps for actually attaching the band itself. So for me, I will start with marking the 2.5 centimetre 1 inch piece that I need to trim off. Okay, and then we will find the scissors and we'll cut that down. Like so. Okay, so that's that piece trimmed off, like so. Now we need to fold back and iron the seam allowance. Now on the pattern piece itself, so if you see here, there are two lines. Not sure how clear that's going to show up on the video. So one line where the dots were is where the centre of the buttonhole band will line up with, and the outside line is the line that we will fold to. So if you were to put it against your piece of fabric, you'll see, hopefully there, I fold it over first. So if I'm going to fold to the line I want to seam, which I'll need to fold the fabric to, we lay this against the pattern piece very carefully, lining up the marks. Okay, so you'll see there the difference between the pattern piece here and the fabric, and that's what we're going to fold to. Okay, like so. And that, from a measurement point of view, is about 1 centimetre. Okay, now if you want, you could mark that on the pattern piece, but I will just fold it like so, finger press, just to get a rough line, and then go to the iron and iron it. Okay, so we've ironed that. So just to be clear, you're ironing right sides together, because when you add on your buttonhole band, that will be contained within the seam, so that will be hidden. Okay. So done that, so the next thing to do is to take the actual buttonhole band itself, which is this piece here, and first things first, we're going to mark on the pattern piece the tailor's marks, which will help us to line it up when we attach it to the front of the shirt. So there's one dot at the top and there will be one dot at the bottom, like so. Okay, so for the interfacing, we need to iron that onto the wrong side of the buttonhole band. It needs to be the width of the buttonhole band less the seam allowance. I find that's easiest then, because then when you fold over you can iron to the seam allowance and it will iron quite neatly. So the buttonhole band itself is 7 centimetres wide. The seam allowance is 1.5 centimetre on each side. So we're going to have a strip of interfacing 4 centimetres wide along the centre of the buttonhole band. Okay, so we have a buttonhole band and I have my piece of interfacing which I'm now going to iron onto the centre, like so. Okay, so we've got our buttonhole band with the interfacing in the centre, seam allowance ironed over, and there we go, that's what it looks like from the right side. So what we now need to do is pin it to the front of the shirt, the left front panel, and we're going to tack it in place to hold it before we actually sew it onto the shirt. Okay, so to help us pin it in place, we have our tailor's chalk marks on the buttonhole band and our tailor's chalk mark on the front of the shirt as well. So we'll use that to help us pin this in place, like so. And the same at the other end, we've got our tailor's chalk mark on the bottom here and on the bottom of the band as well. Like so. So what I will do first is, sorry, get that in shot. I'll pin this roughly onto the shirt before I do my tacking line. Try not to stick the pins in me. So that's it pinned in place. Next thing we're going to do is do a line of tacking stitches, basting stitches to hold it all in place. When it comes to tacking, I generally use orange thread, something my mum used. I think generally on most fabrics it's quite easy to see once you've finished with the tack stitches, it makes it easier for removing them. So we're just going to do a very simple tacking stitch. Okay, so that is the buttonhole band tacked on to the front of the shirt. And that's it looking from the back. Okay, so what we're now going to do is we're going to do a line of stitching on either side of the band to hold it in place and attach it to the shirt front. Okay. Okay, so that is the buttonhole band attached now. I've chosen to use white to do my stitching to attach it, mainly because with using part of the shirt being white itself rather than having to keep on changing out the thread, that's why I've done it all in white. If it's your first shirt or you're not as experienced as you, or you're still not that experienced, you may choose to use a colour that obviously matches with your fabric. You won't then see the stitches so clearly, and there's some little petty faults in there, then it won't show up so much. You'll also note that I haven't chosen to pattern match the button band to the rest of the shirt. For this particular pattern of fabric, I don't think it's so important to do a perfect pattern match. It comes down to personal preference, obviously, at the end of the day. But in this instance, it's slightly different, but I don't think it really matters in relation to the fabric itself. You may have different views, so feel free to let me know. I'll also show you obviously what it looks like on the other side. So there you go. So that's the inside of the shirt. So you can see the, not very clear, I don't suppose. You can see the blue where that's where we folded over the seam allowance, and then you can see that the buttonhole band overlaps that just slightly to give a neat finish. So from the front you don't see any of the inside of the fabric. And you can see there obviously my basting stitch as well, which I'll remove later on. Okay, so now we've done the buttonhole band on the left front, we now need to do the button band on the right front. Okay, so it's a bit more straightforward on the left front. Different patterns will handle this differently, but for this particular pattern, all we're going to do is fold over to give our finished edge of the shirt and where the buttons will then attach onto. Now for this, we are going to add a piece of interfacing as well to help give a slight stiffness to that edge and help to keep the edge quite neat. So what we're going to do is we're going to iron on a piece of interfacing here, per the instructions in the pattern, on the draft pattern that we have here. So this line I talked about before, where we folded the right front two to give our neat edge before we attach the buttonhole band. This is the edge we will now fold to when we make our button band. So if you see here, line this up on the fabric, we're going to fold over this much fabric. Okay. Now first things first, we need to iron on our interfacing. We're going to then iron a 1/4 inch seam allowance just to neaten that edge, and then we're going to fold it over. So what you'll see on the inside is a neat folded edge. So first things first, I'll attach the interfacing. Okay, so we've ironed on our interfacing like so. We folded over the seam allowance edge, and then we folded it over again. Now, I prefer to do a tacking line close to the fold, so that when I turn it over and I put it through the sewing machine to do the top stitching, I know where my backing is and that I get it all caught up fine. It's up to you. You could just obviously measure it and put it through the machine, but I prefer to put a tacking line in first. So I'm going to do that and then sew it down. So I'll show you that once I've done it. Okay, so that's the band tacked in place, with the stitches quite clearly visible on the front. I don't know whether that's come over. Yes, you can see that, I think. So that's the stitch on the front and a stitch on the back. So now I'm going to top stitch that band down. Okay, so there we have it. That is the button band done as well. So that's it from the inside, that's it from the front. So with that and with the buttonhole band done, as I showed you before, we have now finished steps 5 to 8 on the shirt